Well, welcome. This week I'm talking about John chapter 1, verses 43 through 51. That's the gist of my reflection on the calling of Nathaniel. But this is a little bit of background information for that reflection. You can find the reflection itself linked below. Um, but to give you some background, John 1 begins with obviously the prologue, this wonderful 18 verses about metaphysically who Jesus is as the incarnate Word. And then, like the other Gospels, John discusses Jesus' baptism. It's one of the things that all four Gospels agree on, that Jesus' ministry began after he was baptized by John in the Jordan River. But unlike the other Gospels, John shows this exchange a little differently. He makes John a little bit more directly involved in starting Jesus's ministry, at the very least by sending some of his disciples toward Jesus. The other Gospels just kind of have John baptizing Jesus and then they part ways. John's Gospel shows that John the Baptist had some influence with the initial people who followed Jesus, and two disciples of John's follow Jesus initially. One is Andrew, who is Simon Peter's brother and who eventually brings Peter to Jesus. But the other one is unnamed, possibly Philip, who is the first actor in the second account of Jesus calling disciples. But we see that that Andrew and Peter are the first ones called, just like in every other gospel story. And then we see this account of Philip and Nathaniel. Philip is interesting because he has a Greek name. He's one of the few disciples who's mentioned who has a Greek name. This indicates that possibly he has some background in the Greco-Roman world, though he's more than likely a Jew. Had he been a Gentile, I think that the Gospels would have mentioned something about that. That would have been something that would have been odd and worth mentioning. And it's not unheard of for Jews to have common Greek names, especially a name as common as Philip. That would have been quite normal at the time within some Jewish circles to name their children Greek names. And so that he's probably a Gentile, probably a Jew, though he does live in Galilee, northern Judea, or the northern region of what we would think of as of Israel or Judea. And so he does have a little bit more contact with Gentiles than some other Jews. But Jesus meets Philip, and Philip introduces Jesus to Nathaniel. Now, Nathaniel is interesting in part because he's only mentioned in John's Gospel. And we see John give Philip and Nathaniel a lot bigger roles in the circle around Jesus than the other Gospels. The other Gospels don't even mention Nathaniel. And in the other Gospels, Philip is kind of a name, but not really a character. And in John's Gospel, both of them play significant roles within Jesus's ministry. And this is likely due to the fact that the people who John was writing to, or the people who John got his kind of looked to for information, what were knew Philip and Nathaniel. Either if this is John the Apostle, as Christian tradition teaches us, then John the Apostle probably was looking at different encounters that Jesus had, maybe remembered some things a little differently. If this was John the Apostle, maybe he is trying to write to a community that knew Philip and Nathaniel very well. If it is a different John or a different person who is writing this gospel, as some people believe, then maybe this person again knew Philip and Nathaniel, and this is where they got their information from, was from Philip and Nathaniel, and not the same disciples who were informing the other gospel traditions. And this is just one of those mysteries of the New Testament. We just don't have enough information to make real determinations. We just kind of guess. I tend to think that this gospel was written to a community who would have known these two disciples, and probably the community was founded by these two disciples. And so the author of the gospel knew that and was writing this specifically with those stories in mind, to try to say, hey, here's how the people you knew fit into the story. It's entirely possible that there's other explanations. Why is it that Nathaniel is mentioned here as one of Jesus's earliest followers, and maybe one of the 12? Well, that idea of the 12, it was not hard and fast. There are different names in the Gospels that are floated in that group. It's meant to sign or signal that Jesus was choosing his new Israel. It doesn't necessarily mean that these were the 12 disciples and there were no others. There was a larger group of disciples around Jesus. And precisely, if Jesus actually chose a group of specifically these 12, maybe people just didn't quite remember that as well as they thought. Or maybe Jesus said of this larger group, maybe there were 30 disciples, and Jesus said, you are my 12, as in a figurative language, and people started assigning names to that. There's a lot of different explanations for why these names are here, and honestly, they don't really matter too much. The point is that Nathaniel and Philip were both prominent within Jesus's group. These two are from Bethsaida in the north of Galilee, and John makes one other curious note, that this was the hometown of Philip, or of Andrew and Simon. This is different from what we see in Luke's account or Matthew's account, where Philip and Andrew are from Capernaum. It could very well be that they moved from one city to the other earlier in their lives. It could be similar to Jesus, where Jesus in the Gospels is referred to as Jesus of Nazareth, but he seems to have lived in Capernaum. It could be that that Peter and Andrew were born in Bethsaida, but at a later point moved to Capernaum for business or whatever, to expand their business or to relocate their business for whatever reason. It's not a terribly important detail to the text. It's just a note, and it's meant to show us that Philip, Andrew, Peter, Nathaniel, they all kind of were in a similar circle, and that they knew one another. It's meant to show us regionally where Jesus was, and I think in some ways it's meant to show us that Jesus was from a kind of podunk town, or ministering in podunk towns, who had no real political power, whether that was within the temple or the more secular governments. Jesus was drawing from a community that had nothing to offer. And this is kind of the point of Nathaniel's comment, can anything good come out of Nazareth? He doesn't mean that as in good versus evil. Good has multiple meanings. It can mean different things in different contexts. Good in this context means not the opposite of evil, but powerful or elite. Can anything truly monumental and powerful come from Nazareth? That's what Nathaniel is asking. He's not saying, is there anything that is good as opposed to evil? He's saying, is anything powerful going to come out of Nazareth? And the story kind of backs that up, that politically speaking, there really shouldn't have been. And that's part of Jesus's allure, is that he's with the humble, he's with the meek, he's with the poor, not with the elites. And we should take that into consideration as we think about this, as we think about who Nathaniel is and who we are called to be as disciples. Jesus being from a nowhere place, talking to people who really weren't the first options for disciples. They seemed like average Joes who were making livings in other ways, and Jesus is calling them, uh, even though they don't seem to have a desire to be disciples of a rabbi. They don't seem to have that desire to go work, as we would say today, as to go work in ministry. They seem to have other desires, and yet Jesus calls them away from those other desires to say, come, follow me, be part of my movement. Something that would have been somewhat unique. A teacher would have been judged according to how many students he could pull on his own. How many students saw him and said, this is my key to breaking into religious ministry. Jesus isn't doing that. He's going out to places and to people who are not looking for that role and providing it for them. Anyway, that's kind of where my reflection picks up for the week. I hope this information was helpful to understanding John 1. If it is, let me know. If you have more questions or comments, you can always drop those below, and I will deal with them as best I can. Until we meet again, God bless.